Okay, so we've been in church history. This is our sixth part. We've talked about 5 turning points up until now of church history. First one being the destruction of Jerusalem, which forced the church outward from Jerusalem. The second one being the guardrails that they set up, that they used to keep themselves inside of Christianity, being scripture or canon and creeds and episcopacy, or just the order of the church. Third one being the Council of Nicaea, which happened in 325, where they were discussing the divinity of Christ and said the thing that we have held on to ever since, that Christ is one divine, the Trinity rather, is one being with 3 persons, and thus Christ along with the Holy Spirit being divine. Fourthly was the Council of Chalcedon in 451, which said that Jesus is one person with 2 natures, declaring his full humanity. So full divinity at Nicaea, full humanity at Chalcedon. Then last week we spent time looking at monasticism, or monks and nuns and stuff, and talked about all the good things and the bad things that came from that movement, which in large part dominated Christianity from about 500 till about 1300 to 1400. So almost 1,000 years. The primary things that were happening in Christianity were happening by monks, especially when it comes to the spiritual side of Christianity. Other side we'll talk about today a little bit. But the big negatives of monasticism was it ended up creating this sort of 2-tier Christianity, where you had the monks who were like the real Christians, often called the athletes of God, and you had everybody else who was just kind of normal secular people who were Christians as well. Also, probably their largest problem was asceticism, was that they were denying physical pleasures of all kinds, thinking all of them to be bad, along with the material body being bad and evil. And they're known for that still today, not marrying and all those things. And that they swung that pendulum too far in effort of holiness. And then thirdly, that if you weren't careful with their way of living, you often end up in works righteousness, being made righteous by your efforts, by your works. And of course, this is what caused Martin Luther, who was a monk in the 1500s, to lead the Protestant Reformation, which we'll get to eventually. But there were major positives from monasticism. They had incredible devotion, literally giving their lives up to God. They were the first ones really to give out large-scale missionary efforts to bring the gospel much further into Europe and into the known world. They are the reason that we have all the manuscript copies that we have of the scriptures. And the biggest tool that God used by far to give you the Bible today that you have, where you can be confident that you have the same thing that Paul actually wrote, was the monks doing those works. They were extremely benevolent. It is said that the monks civilized Europe, that they brought civilization to Europe, that they went out to the barbarians, and that they saved the barbarians with the Bible, but also with the shovel, that they were teaching them how to farm, that they were experts in draining swamps and irrigation and all kinds of things. And so they were involved in massive benevolence in their communities. They were the first real, what we consider today, apologists, as they were defending the existence of God, and also primarily defending against Islam and Muslim beliefs, which arose in the 600s. They were some of the best learners and thinkers in the history of the world, certainly in the history of Christianity, were monks, guys like Thomas Aquinas, names you've probably heard before. And they were some of the most holy men that have ever lived. Lots of good that came from the monks. Okay, this week, the 6th turning point, what I'm calling it, is the rise of the Pope and Christendom. The rise of the Pope and Christendom. Okay, so December 25th, 800 AD. If I was going to point to one moment that personifies this turning point. December 25th, 800 AD. Jesus was born on December 25th. I don't know, maybe he was. We don't know. But this actually has nothing to do with Christmas. Christmas already was, for a long time, hundreds of years, had already been celebrated at December 25th as the birthday of Christ. They were already doing a lot of things we do today for Christmas. But this event is basically totally coincidental that it happened on December 25th, but is in a lot of ways much more significant to the history of Christianity than us celebrating Christ's birth, whether he did or not, on December 25th. In Rome, on this day, December 25th, 800, the turn of the century, the king of the Franks, who had become to be known as Charlemagne, King Charles, king of the Franks, was in Rome at the time, sort of by happenstance. Ended up there because he was there for battle and then was going to go back home in November, but the weather wasn't good, so he ended up staying. He was getting ready to return, and he's in St. Peter's Cathedral, and he's praying on this day at the end of the service that was occurring, that always occurred on these days. And as he's praying and finishes, there's this big plan that had been put together beforehand that he knew nothing about. And the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, rushes forward as Charlemagne rises from prayer and puts a crown on Charlemagne's head. And as he does so, all the people in the cathedral have already been instructed to cry out. And they said, to Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peace-giving emperor of the Romans, life and victory. So we have this moment where this king he was the king of the Franks, is in the church praying, rises from prayer. The Pope rushes forward, almost like an ambush, puts the crown on his head, and everyone stands up and cheers, Emperor of Rome, the Emperor of Rome, the Emperor of Rome. And he is now crowned the Emperor of Rome by the Pope. And Charlemagne later says that if he would have known that was going to happen, he would never have gone into the cathedral. He didn't want it to occur, and yet it had occurred and kind of backed him into the corner of accepting the invitation as Pope Leo crowned him. Now, the event itself is not really the turning point, but the point is this. We had gotten to a place by 800. We had gotten to a place where the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, to be specific, where the Bishop of Rome had the ability and the authority to crown the Emperor of Rome, to single-handedly come forward and declare that this person would now be the emperor of the greatest nation in the world. And he did that. So we'd come to this place where he had that sort of power. This time period really, this idea of Christendom, historians date it at different places, but most of them date it to beginning at this moment. Christendom meaning a lot of things, but really meaning the state and the church reigning together is the basic idea of Christendom. And this idea that it began here as Charlemagne rises as king, and this new next 500 or so years period, which is referred to often as Christendom or the High Middle Ages. Okay, so firstly, the Pope, how we get to this point. It's complicated because we mentioned a few weeks ago, the Greek word for Pope, papus, was originally applied to high church officials everywhere. Right? So there was a time where almost every elder could be called a pope, like he was called a bishop, like he was called an overseer. It was just another word that meant church leader or overseer. They were called popes. There were popes everywhere. Especially in the East, they called all their bishops popes for a long time, for many, many years. And that didn't stop being the case altogether until the 11th century. So we're talking about the 11th century. There are still people that are using the word pope in ways that just mean church leader. But already in the 200s and 300s, there are some bishops of Rome, bishop just meaning elder, but it became to be something else, bishops of Rome who were already writing saying that the Rome bishopric was above all the other ones. Okay, so those arguments started being made in the late 200s, 300s, and were made better and better in the years to come, that the Roman bishop was higher than the rest. It's difficult because there isn't like one moment, which would be very easy for us. There isn't one moment where they go from, okay, the Pope is just Roman bishops with the rest of the bishops, and then all of a sudden there's like he signs a document, and now he's the Pope with the high hat, and he's over everybody else. It was a very slow, incremental shift as he became more and more important, literally over the centuries. We're talking about over hundreds of years. He just gained a little more importance, and a little more importance, and a little more importance. The evidence of the power of slow, incremental change over this time period. Now, very early, Rome was considered to be one of the most important bishops. Why? Well, because it's Rome, first of all. It was Rome. It was the central and first flag-waving city of the empire. And so naturally, the bishop over the greatest city was going to carry a little more weight. And he did. Far before Pope was used for him or those arguments were being put forth, the Bishop of Rome carried more weight because indeed it was the Bishop of Rome. Even biblically, Rome, it was significant, right? Paul's death probably happened in Rome. The book of Acts ends with Paul in Rome. Romans, the letter of Romans, was very early considered to be the greatest epistle written. Paul's magnum opus, his highest and most mature and finished theology, was in the book of Romans, which was written to Rome. The book of Revelation almost definitely has some allusions to Rome, either directly or indirectly. Probably the The 10-headed beast, or 10-horned, 7-headed beast, was probably a reference to Rome. So Rome is a very significant character city in the Bible. And so there's lots of reasons that Rome became sort of this weightier bishopric. But it wasn't the most weighty, it was just one of the weighty ones. There was Constantinople, and there were other cities that had very significant bishops, and Rome was one of those. And on top of that, most of the Roman bishops were great men of God, were very wise, wrote very beautiful and deep theology, and some of them were absolute giants, doing massive things for Christianity. We talked about Leo the Great a few weeks ago with the Council of Chalcedon, and he wrote a document called Leo's Tome, which was extremely significant in helping the church understand Christ. Very biblical, very profound, understanding how Christ is who he said he is and all those things. Another man named Gregory, Pope named Gregory, both called the Great, Leo the Great and Gregory the Great, his list of accomplishments that he did in his time as Pope or as Bishop of Rome is breathtaking, and yet he seemed always to be this humble and pious man. So that when others were debating with him, one famous thing is he was debating with another bishop about something, and the other bishop demanded that that Gregory referred to him as the patriarch of whatever city he was from. And Gregory, in passing, said that all he ever wanted to be referred to as was the servant of the Lord's servants. And that's still the phrase the popes use today, the servant of the Lord's servants, the servant of servants. There were great men and high men and men worthy of praise that were the bishops of Rome. And so we have this sort of incremental change happening where Rome's a big deal in the beginning, but as you have these great men who are sort of towering figures that hold that office, and you have these more arguments being progressed that the Roman bishop was higher, it just moves in this incremental direction, leading us toward the place where he could crown the emperor in 800. But the argument is from Matthew 16. That the main place the argument came from is Matthew 16, a place you all know well, a place that, in fact, we've put as the theme of our series, or one of the themes of our series here in church history. Matthew 16, verse 15. Jesus said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who's in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock," Peter's name means rock, there's a play there. "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Now, there's basically two sides to how to view this passage. The Protestant side, which is our side, is normally to say that what he's saying there is, on this rock I will build my church. He's referring to the confession of faith. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus is saying that is correct what you're saying. On that faith, I will build my church. And the gates of hell will not prevail against that faith and that church. And when he says, "I'll give you the keys of the kingdom," he's speaking to the apostles as a whole and even to the church as a whole. That we have the keys, the church has the keys, the apostles have the keys, the church has the keys in a way that they didn't before him. "I'll give you the keys to the kingdom. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, will be loosed on earth will be loosed in heaven," etc. Now, the Catholic way to understand this is what's crucial for us today, is that he was talking about Peter in particular. "Peter, on you I will build my church. I will give you the keys to the kingdom." Okay, so in the Catholic mind, Peter was the first pope. He was, and that argument wasn't made for about 300 years after this, which is significant. One of the bishops of Rome started making that argument, well, I guess 200 years later, in the late 200s. And then most significantly, Leo made the argument further in his tome, about 100 years after that. But the argument is that in Matthew 16, Jesus was not just saying this faith and this statement in the church, he was saying Peter in particular. And so you could go online right now probably, but the Catholic Church has this line that goes from Peter all the way to the Pope that is today. What Pope, Bishop of Rome, followed Peter? What bishop followed that guy? What bishop followed that guy? All the way down to the one that has today. And so the idea is that Peter had this authority that was special, and that he passed that authority down to the next pope, to the next pope, to the next pope, and that still today that pope has that authority that Peter has. Even though, by the way, obviously the pope today has far, 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 far more authority than the Pope had even in 800 when he crowned the emperor, at least in the spiritual world, ability to do things and power to do things. But that's the idea, that Peter was the first pope, and there's been a lineage of popes passed on after that, and it is the pope that has the keys to the kingdom. It's the pope that God is building the church on, etc. Okay, thoughts on that? Yeah, let me push forward, and maybe this will help some. Okay, so with this idea of Christendom, there's a lot of things that go into this, but one of the big things is that Islam came on the scene in the early 600s, and it became very quickly a military power, along with allegedly being a spiritual power, where Muhammad, we're talking about in early 600s, has his vision, tries to make that happen in Medina. Medina kicks him out of town. He goes to, or Mecca rather. Mecca kicks him out of town. He goes to Medina, gathers up followers, militarily conquers Medina. 8 years later, goes back to Mecca, conquers Mecca, which is now the center of it all, you probably know. And then 2 years after that, a third of all of Arabia, of all of that area of the world, was Muslim. 2 years after that, the entirety of Arabia was Muslim. We're talking about rapid expansion of Islam and Christianity freaking out a little bit. And so what we have is, in Charlemagne, is his grandfather had the first real victory against the Saracens, against the Islamic forces, had the first real victory. And ever since then, the allies that defeated the Islamic forces have been passed down from king to king. And so now the king of Franks, Charlemagne, is really the power that holds back the Islamic nations still about 100 years after all this stuff has slowed down. And he is crowned in large part because of his military power and his ability to hold back Islamic nations. But for the next 800 years, really, after this event, everything is technically Christian. Politics are Christian, learning is Christian, government organization is Christian, art is Christian, music's Christian, economics is Christian, the law of Europe would be Christian. Not necessarily when I say Christian in the truest sense of that, right, where they're affected in their hearts by the gospel, but that it had the check mark of the church on it. Right? It had the, well, yeah, it's technically Christian, this is along with the church. There was absolutely no separation of church and state, right? It was emperor, holy Roman emperor, by the way, the word holy there being significant, holy Roman emperor and pope leading the empire of Rome together, side by side. Pope really having supremacy in a lot of things because everyone recognized the most important thing was spiritual things and salvation, and so the king very often would bow to the pope and let the pope make decisions on things. Everything based on the Christian faith, allegedly, or sort of Christian faith. And that's why to this day, if you go to Europe, there are still church establishments in every country you go to, but very few of them are still Christian, meaning very few of them have any faith that go along with it. It's just kind of tokenism, Christianity. And that's because for 800 years, everything was controlled by the church, and in that sense, Christian, in this time of Christendom. Okay, so in this time period, they still believed and taught the gospel. They taught that sinners need to be saved by grace. They taught that still. They needed the Lord. They needed faith and needed to lean on the Lord. The thing that made this era distinct, and here we really start seeing the Catholic Church become its own thing slowly but surely, that needed to be reformed. The thing that was distinct about this era is what's been called sacramentalism, which means they knew that you needed to get the grace of God, but the question is, how do you go about doing that? How do you go about getting the grace of God? Where we would say faith and submission to God and the things that come along with that. They set up these things, which you know the word, but you may not know the history of it. They set up sacraments, and the sacraments were the way that you contacted the grace of God. They were the way that you received God's grace. And there were 7 sacraments that went to the entirety of life. And these sacraments actually imparted the grace of God to you regardless of what was happening in your heart. Right? So we'll talk about in a minute the Protestant sacraments. But us, we don't believe anything can happen to you apart from your heart being a faithful one. Right? If I believed the baptismal waters were effective on their own, we'd be dunking everyone that comes in the door before they left, whether they wanted to or not. Right? But we believe something must be going on in the heart, otherwise it's just tokenism. Otherwise it's nothing. Sacramentalism was stronger, saying these things actually are imparting grace, and it's less concerned with what's going on in your heart. Okay, 7 sacraments. Any thoughts on what they may be? Or just throw out one of them? Baptism. Yep, that's the sacrament of birth. The sacrament of penance, which is the sacrament of confession, and that could be in form of prayer, form of giving money, like Aubrey said. Eucharist, yeah, the sacrament of the Eucharist, which is communion, Lord's Supper. Sacrament of nourishment, the soul being nourished. Confirmation. The sacrament of coming of age, marriage. The sacrament of creating a family. Yeah, y'all are doing great. They call it extreme unction, but it's the sacrament of death or mourning death. And then the sacrament of ordination, ordinating, of making priests. And then ordination is the one that allows all the other ones. You got to have priests because no one can do these things except priests, right? And this is very significant because the only one that can administer these things is the official church, right? What becomes the Roman Catholic Church. It has to be the church that baptizes you. You can't confess to anybody, right? You got to confess to the priests. You got to confess to the church. Communion only happens in the church. Coming of age, confirmation is something that must happen in the church. Marriage must happen in the church. Death is tied with the church, et cetera, et cetera. It's all with the church. And this is, my family went to a funeral of my uncle, who was Catholic, a few weeks ago, and there was a lot of language that was tied back to the sacrament of baptism that happened at his birth. That's, their baptism, infant baptism, has nothing to do with faith, of course, because it's an infant. But it's this sacrament of bestowing grace upon the individual, regardless of those things. So this raised the importance of the Catholic Church even higher because the way to get God's grace was through the sacraments, and the only way you could get the sacraments was through the church. And so it became very Roman Catholic Church centric because the Roman Catholic Church held the means of grace, held the ways that you get grace. So salvation moved away from being a thing that was primarily about the heart submitted to God, and moved more towards doing the sacraments and doing the right things that you're supposed to do to receive God's grace. Scripture didn't become irrelevant, but it was a after the fact sort of situation where they had the sacraments, and then decades, even centuries later, they went back and kind of added the Scripture to the sacraments and said, this is the reason this is a sacrament. It was a sort of after the fact thing for a system that was already in place. Okay, now, traditionally, though we'll talk about in a minute about the word, but traditionally Protestants, which is everyone who's not Catholic, basically, us, have talked about two sacraments, which are baptism and communion. Yeah, two sacraments, baptism and communion, which Protestants have from the beginning said are useless without faith. Right? So baptism without faith, and there's an infant baptism quandary there that I don't want to get into, but that those things happening without faith in some end, that communion happening without faith is useless. I reached out to various different minister friends of mine of all persuasions and denominations and just asked them to define a sacrament, because I've always struggled to really understand what people are saying. And I figured out the reason is because everyone says different things. There's a lot of different views on how you talk about a sacrament as a Protestant. But the most helpful thing I found is the advice that we shouldn't use, and we don't use the word sacrament. Traditionally what it's used is the word ordinance. Because sacrament means holy, and everything's holy. Of course, marriage is holy in that sense. But ordinance meaning the thing that God assigned for all Christians to do. Right, so God ordained for Christians of all shapes and sizes to be baptized and to take communion. He didn't ordain all Christians to be married. Right? There's the difference there. That it's God calling all Christians to do these two things as a representation of the gospel and of the church. And now, I say that to say, one of the things I think we probably did well here at the Church of Christ is this category doesn't seem all that helpful to me. I don't, as much as I put effort into it, I don't see reason that we really need to we really need to use the word sacrament or ordinance or set these things apart. We're going to do them. We're going to baptize. We're going to place a lot of emphasis on communion without calling them ordinances or sacraments, all those things. It seems like something that we've kind of held on to from that time period that we probably didn't need to. It should be the fact that baptism is connected to the local church. Maybe we've missed that some. I think that's true. sacraments, these things that connect to the church. I think baptism should not be separated from the local church. Not meaning you can't do it out in the river. That's great. That's the way they did it in the first century. But I shouldn't like go out and just start baptizing folks and then just sending them off into the wilderness and just hoping for the best, right? That I don't have that. But that baptism should happen in connection with the local church. So if someone's baptized, they're then going to someone's church that Sunday and being led into in discipleship and taught how to obey and all those things. That there should be a direct connection with the church when it comes to baptism. And that's obviously true with communion. There's a whole debate about this during COVID, but you really can't take communion apart from the assembly. Now, there's extreme exceptions, which I know God honors, the people that just cannot get here. Right? And so we bring it to them. That's a beautiful thing, and that's great. But in general, communion is meant to be and can only be, by definition, in the body of Christ with the people of God, etc. It's meant to be a communal thing, and it was done that way historically. That it was something that happened in the church, and it should be done that way. It shouldn't be something that's done separately. One of the main issues that virtual church is nonsense. Okay, so the role of the church became less of shepherding people's souls, leading them to Christ, and more of just distributing the sacraments. We do the sacrament things. Very ritualistic, as you probably think of the Catholic Church. We do these step-by-step thing, and it's because our job as the church is distributing the sacraments, where the people will receive the grace of God. Again, at the heart of the ideal was that grace would be a part of all of life. Right? You need grace at your birth. You need grace at your confirmation. You need grace at everything. Every stage of life needs grace. But of course, being humans as we are, it became just sort of a ritualistic thing. I check off my sacrament box, make sure I get the grace, and then I'm off into heaven. So Islam comes along and threatens, and so we have this moment where the Pope rises up, kings, right, make Charlemagne king, and then for the next 800 years we have this Christendom where the church is institutional in the ultimate sense. Okay, questions?